Hey everyone and welcome back. Today we're going to take a deep dive into, well, a tragic story really. A U.S. Marine Sergeant, Jacob M. Durham, was recently killed in a plane crash.
Whoa.
And,
Oh, wow.
yeah, in the Philippines. It's a story with a lot of layers to it. So we're going to break it down using a couple of different sources, some early reports we were able to pull, and this CBS News article. Really want to understand, what happened and what it all means.
Yeah, for sure. And this incident really does highlight how complicated U.S. military operations can be, especially in a region as strategically important as the Philippines.
Right, for sure. So let's start with Sergeant Durham. Who was this guy? Well, he's based out of Camp Pendleton, California, and specialized in electronic intelligence and electromagnetic warfare. He'd only joined the Marines in 2021, but was already a sergeant.
Wow, that's a fast rise.
I know, right? And that specialization, electronic intelligence, that's critical these days. Think about it, like in the South China Sea, where the U.S. needs to keep an eye on Chinese warships. That's where electronic intelligence comes in.
Absolutely. It's all about picking up signals, analyzing communications, basically figuring out what the other side is up to without them even knowing you're there.
It's like invisible warfare.
In a way, yeah.
And it sounds like Sergeant Durham was really good at it. I mean, the reports mentioned he'd already received a bunch of awards: Navy Marine Corps Commendation Medal, Marine Corps Good Conduct Medal, National Defense Service Medal.
And a meritorious mast. That's a big deal.
Right.
Not just a routine award. Means he did something truly exceptional. And his commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Mabel B. Annunziata, had some really powerful words about him. Said that Srat Durham embodied the highest traditions of the Marine Corps, exemplifying composure, intelligence, and selfless leadership. He was deeply respected and loved by his fellow Marines.
Wow.
Really gets you, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. Easy to forget, that these stories involve real people with families and friends who love them. So what was he doing in the Philippines in the first place?
It seems he was part of a mission providing intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance support to the Philippines. These missions might sound pretty routine, but they're vital for stability in a region that's got a lot of tension.
Yeah, especially now.
For sure, yeah.
The U.S. Indo-Pacific Command called the flight part of routine U.S.-Philippine security cooperation activities. But what does that actually mean?
Well, security cooperation can cover lots of things, from joint training exercises to intelligence sharing. Basically, it's all part of the U.S. strategy to maintain a strong presence in the region and deter any potential adversaries.
Okay, so this wasn't some massive operation either. We're talking about a small plane, just Sergeant Durham and 3 defense contractors on board.
Exactly. And that small team suggests a very specific, specialized task.
Right. Okay, so the crash itself happened at a rice field near a town called Ampatuan in the southern Philippines. And according to reports, people saw smoke and heard an explosion before the plane went down.
Right. A provincial disaster mitigation officer named Windy Beauty said residents reported seeing the smoke and then hearing the explosion.
So that obviously be important for the investigators as they try to figure out what happened.
Absolutely.
So what caused the crash?
Well, that's the big question, right? All we know for sure is that it's under investigation. And these investigations can be very complex, especially when you've got an incident involving multiple countries and potentially sensitive information.
It's like a puzzle with missing pieces.
Kinda, yeah.
You might not get answers for a while. But, as we dig deeper, it's important to remember that this didn't just happen out of nowhere. The U.S. has a long history of military involvement in the Philippines.
Oh, absolutely. U.S. forces have been there for decades working with Filipino forces to counter terrorism and, maintain stability. But that presence itself has roots in a really complex history between the two countries.
So the relationship goes way back.
The Philippines was actually a U.S. territory for almost 50 years. And even after independence in 1946, the two countries stayed close allies. There's even a mutual defense treaty that goes all the way back to 1951.
Hold on. Mutual Defense Treaty. What's that?
It's basically a promise that both countries will defend each other if one gets attacked. So if the Philippines were attacked, the U.S. would be obligated to help and vice versa.
Wow. So that treaty, that's a pretty big deal then.
It's a cornerstone of the U.S.-Philippines relationship and a key factor in the whole balance of power in the region.
So this crash, even if it was an accident, could have ripple effects on that whole relationship.
Absolutely. It just adds another layer of complexity to an already tense situation.
It's feeling like every single event is connected to this bigger global, chess game.
Yeah, kind of, yeah.
Speaking of changing dynamics, didn't the Philippines just elect a new president?
They did. Ferdinand Marcos Jr., the son of the former dictator, took office last year. and everyone's watching to see what his stance is on the U.S. military presence.
What is his stance?
Well, he said he wants to maintain close ties with the U.S., but he's also working on improving relations with China.
Which is a major economic partner for the Philippines.
Exactly. It's a tough balancing act, for sure.
So it seems like even something like this plane crash, seemingly isolated, can have huge consequences in a region as complicated as the South China Sea.
Right. It's a reminder that we can't just look at these events in isolation. They're all
Yeah.
connected to this web of, historical, political, and economic factors.
Okay, so we've got the crash, the investigation, this whole U.S.-Philippines relationship, the South China Sea all swirling around. What I'm really wondering now is, what does this all mean for Sergeant Durham's mission? What were they actually doing out there?
Well, the details are still scarce because of the sensitive nature of the mission. We know it involved intelligence surveillance and reconnaissance support, but the specifics of what they were doing are still classified.
Right. I get why they can't release all the details, especially if it involves sensitive intel gathering.
Mhm.
But it does make you wonder, right?
It does. But that's where critical thinking comes in. Got to be careful about jumping to conclusions or filling in the blanks with speculation. We got to stick to the facts we have and acknowledge what we don't know.
So you're saying no conspiracy theories.
Yeah, exactly.
All right, so given what we do know,
Mm-hmm.
what can we reasonably conclude about their mission?
Well, we can reasonably say that the mission was considered important enough to involve highly specialized personnel like Sergeant Durham. And the fact that they were using a small aircraft suggests they might have been trying to keep a low profile, maybe for discreet operations.
So they were doing something pretty important, even if we don't know exactly what.
It definitely points to the ongoing cooperation between the U.S. and the Philippines on security matters, even if those activities are often kept secret.
And that cooperation itself speaks volumes, right? It shows that the U.S.-Philippines alliance is still strong, despite all the, complexities and potential friction we talked about.
Absolutely. And this is where it gets really interesting. This crash, as tragic as it is, it's a stark reminder of the delicate balance that countries have to strike,
Yeah.
between their own national interests, the need for international cooperation, and just the unpredictable nature of events.
It's a lot to juggle.
For sure.
And it highlights the human cost of these geopolitical maneuvers. Sergeant Durham was a young man with his whole life ahead of him, dedicated to serving his country. It's a reminder that behind all the policy debates and strategic maneuvering, there are real people with families and futures.
Yeah, it's a sobering thought. And it really underscores the importance of responsible leadership, clear communication, and a commitment to diplomacy and, peaceful resolutions.
Well said. This deep dive has really opened my eyes to how complicated things are in that region and how even seemingly isolated events can have huge consequences. There's still one big question in my mind. What happens next? How will this crash impact the U.S.-Philippines relationship moving forward?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And it's one that'll probably play out over the months and years to come. But I think we can look to the past for some clues.
Okay, what kind of clues?
Well, the U.S.-Philippines relationship has had its ups and downs. There have been disagreements, base closures, even calls to end the Mutual Defense Treaty. But the alliance has always endured. It's pretty resilient and adaptable.
So you're saying that even though this crash is a big deal, it's probably not going to completely derail the relationship.
That's my take, yeah, based on history and the current geopolitical climate. Both countries have a strong interest in staying close, especially with China's growing influence, looming over everything.
That makes sense. But there's got to be some fallout, right? Some reassessments or maybe even policy changes after a tragedy like this?
Oh, there's bound to be. There'll be pressure to re-examine safety protocols, clarify the rules of engagement for U.S. forces in the Philippines, and strengthen communication between the two governments. We might even see a renewed debate about the purpose and scope of the U.S. military presence in the region.
And how much will the outcome of the crash investigation affect those debates?
If the investigation finds that, U.S. personnel were negligent or did something wrong, it could fuel demands for greater accountability and potentially limit U.S. operations in the Philippines.
And what if it's just a genuine accident? No fault on either side.
Even then, it's likely to prompt a closer look at risk factors and safety procedures. Might also push for more transparency about U.S. military activities in the Philippines as a way to build trust and address any concerns.
So even if the crash itself doesn't fundamentally change the U.S.-Philippines relationship, it's going to force both sides to ask some tough questions and make some difficult decisions.
Exactly. That's the reality of diplomacy and international relations. It's a constant process of adapting, negotiating, and readjusting in response to changing circumstances. This plane crash, as tragic as it is, it's just the latest chapter in that story.
Wow, this is a lot to process. I feel like we've just scratched the surface here. Is there anything else in these reports that we haven't touched on that you think is worth highlighting?
One thing that stood out to me was the presence of those defense contractors on the plane. It really highlights the growing role of private companies in military operations around the world.
Oh, that's a good point. We hear about defense contractors all the time, but it's easy to forget about them in the context of like a specific event like this crash. What are the implications of their involvement?
Well, it raises questions about accountability, transparency, and potential conflicts of interest. Defense contractors often operate in kind of a legal gray area. Their activities can be difficult to monitor or regulate, and their presence blurs the lines between traditional military operations and what some call privatized warfare.
It's like a whole other layer of
It
complexity,
really is.
and one that probably deserves its own deep dive someday. But for now, let's stick with the immediate aftermath of this crash and its impact on U.S.-Philippines relations. What are the key things we should be watching for in the coming weeks and months?
I think the most important thing is to follow the progress of the investigation. See what conclusions they reach. That's going to set the stage for everything that comes after.
Right, the investigation will really shape the narrative and how the public perceives what happened. What else should we be keeping an eye on?
Pay close attention to what both governments are saying and doing, especially President Marcos Jr. and his administration. How they respond to the crash will tell us a lot about their priorities and their approach to the U.S.-Philippines alliance.
So reading between the lines, looking for those subtle shifts that might indicate a change in direction.
Exactly. We should also watch for any signs of increased military cooperation or tension in the South China Sea. This crash could be a catalyst for either scenario, depending on how both sides react.
It's like this delicate balancing act where every move has the potential to tip the scales one way or the other.
It really is.
This deep dive has given me a whole new understanding of how complex international relations are and how much is at stake.
It's a constant game of chess. Multiple players shifting alliances and unpredictable consequences. And as we've seen with this plane crash, even seemingly isolated events can have far-reaching implications.
Well said. I feel like we've covered a lot of ground here, but I'm sure there's still so much more to uncover. But for now, I think it's time to wrap up this part of our deep dive and leave our listeners with something to think about.
I agree. This incident has raised a lot of important questions that deserve more thought and analysis. It's a reminder that the world is interconnected. Even seemingly distant events can have ripple effects close to home. And the choices we make today will shape the world of tomorrow.
That's a great point to end on. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive. It's been enlightening and honestly a little unsettling. But I think it's a journey we all need to take from time to time to remind ourselves of the complex challenges we face as a global community.
Couldn't agree more. It's in these moments of reflection and critical analysis that we can begin to make sense of a world that often feels chaotic and unpredictable.
To our listeners, we encourage you to keep exploring these issues, challenge your assumptions, seek out different perspectives, and engage in those thoughtful conversations about the future we want to create. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next time on The Deep Dive.
It's interesting to think about how even something like this plane crash, an accident, can become part of a larger story, a strategic narrative, especially in a place as contested as the South China Sea.
Yeah, like all those ripples we were talking about, how something that seems isolated can actually spread outward and impact the bigger picture.
Exactly. And the South China Sea is already a very complex environment. You've got all these different countries, China, the Philippines, Vietnam, all vying for control over these little islands and reefs scattered across the sea.
What's so important about these islands? Why is everyone fighting over them?
Well, for one thing, there's the potential for huge amounts of oil and natural gas under the seabed. Whoever controls those resources, could get a big economic boost.
So it's all about the money.
It's partly about resources, yeah, but it's also about strategy. These islands could be used as military bases, allowing a country to project power and control over those vital shipping lanes.
So it's about who has the most influence in the region.
Exactly. And that's where the U.S. presence in the Philippines comes in. Many see it as a way to balance out China's growing assertiveness in the region.
So this plane crash, even if it was an accident, could be used by different sides to push their own agendas in the South China Sea.
Oh, absolutely. Some might use it to argue that the U.S. presence is actually destabilizing the region, while others might say it's more important than ever to have a strong U.S. presence to, deter aggression.
It sounds like a really delicate situation. Like even a small spark could ignite a much bigger conflict.
That's a good way to put it, yeah. And that's why understanding the historical context and the motivations of all the players involved is so crucial.
Speaking of history, you mentioned earlier that the Philippines was a U.S. territory for almost 50 years. That's a really long time. How did that happen?
Well, it's a complicated story. Goes back to the late 1800s. The U.S. got the Philippines from Spain after the Spanish-American War in 1898.
So it was like a colony.
Essentially, yes. And the relationship between the U.S. and the Philippines during that time was often full of tension and conflict. There were lots of uprisings and rebellions against U.S. rule.
Wow, I had no idea. I guess the history between the two countries is a lot more complicated than I realized.
It is, yeah. And those historical experiences still shape the relationship today. Even after the Philippines got independence in 1946, the two countries stayed connected strategically and culturally.
So this crash happens, with this long and complicated history as backdrop.
Yeah.
And then you add in the South China Sea tensions and the new president, Ferdinand Marcos Jr.
It's a lot.
It is a lot, yeah. It's all connected. And speaking of Marcos Jr., it's worth noting that he's walking a very fine line when it comes to the U.S. and China.
What do you mean?
He wants to keep that strong security alliance with the U.S., but he also knows that China is a huge economic partner for the Philippines. He doesn't want to alienate either side. So he's trying to play both sides.
Not necessarily. I think he's genuinely trying to find a way to balance the interests of both countries while putting the Philippines first. You know? It's a tough spot to be in.
Yeah, it's a real balancing act. And this plane crash has probably made it even harder.
It definitely adds another layer of complexity, for sure.
You mentioned earlier that the crash could be used to advance different agendas in the South China Sea. Can you give me like a specific example?
Sure. Let's say the investigation finds that the U.S. military was negligent in some way. China could use that to say that the U.S. presence is a threat to stability and that the Philippines should rethink its alliance with the U.S.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
What about the other side? How could the U.S. use this?
Well, they could emphasize how important that joint security cooperation is and argue that the crash, while tragic, highlights the need to keep working together, to address those common threats in the region. They might even increase military aid or joint exercises as a way to show their commitment to the Philippines.
It sounds like this crash could either bring the U.S. and the Philippines closer or push them further apart.
Yeah.
Just depends how things play out.
Exactly. And that's why it's important to pay attention to how both governments respond over the next few weeks and months. Their actions will tell us more than their words.
Speaking of actions, what are some concrete steps we might see the U.S. and the Philippines take in response to this crash?
Well, on the security front, we might see more patrols in the South China Sea, both by the U.S. and the Philippines. Could also be more joint training exercises, designed to improve how they work together and present that united front.
What about on the diplomatic side?
We might see high-level meetings between U.S. and Philippine officials, to discuss the investigation, reaffirm the alliance, and coordinate their response to any fallout.
And what about internally within each country?
The U.S. will probably do its own review of safety protocols and procedures for military operations in the region. And the Philippines might review its agreements with the U.S., regarding the military presence and activities on their soil.
It's like a lot of dominoes falling.
It is, and it's important to remember that all of this is happening in the context of this larger competition between the U.S. and China.
Okay, let's talk about that more. What exactly are the U.S. and China competing for in this region?
It's a complex competition. It's about economic influence, military power, and diplomatic clout. China wants to be the dominant force in Asia, both economically and militarily. And the U.S. wants to maintain its position as a global superpower and prevent China from becoming too powerful.
So like a tug of war.
Yeah, kind of. And the Philippines is right in the middle.
That's got to be tough for them to navigate.
It is. Takes a lot of strategic thinking and careful diplomacy.
Speaking of diplomacy, what role do other countries in the region play in all of this?
That's a great question. Countries like Japan, South Korea, Australia, even India are all watching closely. They've got their own interests in the region, and they're trying to figure out how to respond to China's growing influence.
It's like everyone's playing a giant game of chess trying to predict the next move.
It is a bit like that. And just like in chess, there are risks and rewards with every move.
Yeah, so what are some of the risks for the Philippines as they try to navigate all of this?
One risk is that they could become too dependent on one side, whether it's the U.S. or China. Another risk is getting caught in the middle of a conflict between the two superpowers.
And what about the rewards?
Well, they could benefit economically from closer ties with China, but they could also benefit from the security guarantees that come with the U.S. alliance. In the end, the Philippines wants to maintain its sovereignty and independence while getting the most out of its economic and security partnerships.
It's like a tough balancing act.
It is. Takes a lot of skill and foresight.
This whole situation feels so overwhelming. It's hard to imagine how these leaders make decisions with so much at stake.
I know what you mean. It's easy to get lost in all the complexity. But I think it's important to remember that at the heart of all of this are real people whose lives are directly affected by the choices their leaders make.
It brings us back to Sergeant Durham. His death was a tragic reminder of the human cost of all this.
Absolutely. And his story should make us all think critically about what our own country's role is in the world and how our actions impact individuals like him.
It's a sobering thought.
It is, but an important one.
We've covered a lot of ground here. From the crash itself to the history of U.S.-Philippines relations, the South China Sea tensions, China's role, the challenges facing President Marcos Jr. A lot to unpack.
It is, yeah. And really, we've only scratched the surface. There's so much more to explore and understand about this whole situation.
Before we move on, is there anything else we should mention about the bigger context here? Any other players or factors we haven't talked about yet?
There's one more thing, and it goes back to something we discussed earlier. The defense contractors on the plane. This incident really highlights the rise of, the privatization of warfare.
Right, you mentioned that. What exactly does that mean? Privatization of warfare.
It means that governments are relying more and more on private military companies to do things that used to be done by the National Armed Forces.
So instead of sending in soldiers, they're hiring private companies to do the fighting.
Not always fighting, but often things like logistics, training, security, even intelligence gathering.
Why would governments do that? What's the advantage?
Well, there are a few. One is that it can be seen as a way to reduce the number of official military casualties, which can be politically sensitive.
So it's a way to avoid backlash when soldiers die.
In a way, yeah.
Yeah.
It also lets governments operate more quietly. Using private contractors doesn't always require the same level of public scrutiny or, approval from Congress like deploying troops would.
But what about accountability? If a private contractor messes up, who's responsible?
That's one of the big concerns with all of this. The lines of accountability can get really blurry. Private military companies operate under contracts, and their legal status isn't always clear.
So it's not always obvious who's in charge or who to blame if something goes wrong.
Exactly. And that lack of clarity can make it really hard to investigate incidents like this plane crash and hold people accountable.
It also makes you think about whether it's even ethical to use private companies for jobs that are so closely tied to war.
You're right. There are some serious ethical questions here. Some people argue that it weakens the traditional role of the military and creates this dangerous mix of public and private interests.
Sounds like a slippery slope.
It can be. And it's a debate that's probably going to keep going as this trend continues.
So we have the crash, the U.S. and the Philippines, China, and now the involvement of private military contractors. It's a lot to think about.
It is, yeah. But I think we've covered the major players and the key dynamics. Now we just have to see how everything unfolds and what it all means for the future of U.S.-Philippines relations and the bigger picture.
All right, sounds like a good place to take a break. When we come back, we'll dive into the potential consequences of all of this, the ethical questions it raises, and what it could mean for the future of the region. Stay tuned. All right, so we're back. We've been talking about this plane crash in the Philippines, trying to understand the whole situation and what it all means. But I kind of want to go back to something you mentioned earlier, the human cost of all this.
Yeah. It's easy to get caught up in the politics and the strategy, but it's important to remember that there are real people whose lives are changed by these events. Sergeant Durham's story is a stark reminder of that.
His commanding officer called him the embodiment of the Marine Corps' highest traditions. Makes you wonder what kind of person he was, what kind of impact he had on the people around him.
Right. And it's not just him. His family, his friends, his fellow Marines, they're all dealing with this loss.
It's really sad.
Huh?
And it makes you think about the decisions that led to those individuals being in danger in the first place.
Those are tough questions for sure. Like where do we draw the line? When does national interest outweigh the value of human life? It's not easy.
And it gets even more complicated when you bring in the private military contractors like we saw in this case.
Definitely. It makes accountability even more difficult. When private companies are involved in military operations, things can get really murky.
It's like we're outsourcing war, and the people who pay the price aren't always subject to the same rules as regular soldiers.
Yeah, it's a worrying trend. Brings up some serious ethical questions about transparency, oversight, and potential conflicts of interest.
So we've talked about the potential consequences for the U.S. and the Philippines and, the whole geopolitical situation. But what about the families of those who died?
We can't forget about them. They're the ones left behind to deal with the grief and the uncertainty. They deserve our support and compassion.
This whole deep dive has been really eye-opening. It's made me realize how connected everything is and how even something like this plane crash can have these huge ripple effects.
It's a good reminder that we're all part of this global system. What happens in one place can really impact what happens everywhere else.
So where do we go from here? What are the key things we should take away from all of this?
I think the biggest takeaway is that we need to be engaged and think critically about these issues. We can't just, passively watch the news. We need to ask questions and challenge what we hear and consider different perspectives.
And remember, the people involved
Yeah.
behind the headlines and the policy debates are real people whose lives are affected by the decisions their leaders make.
For sure. And we owe it to them to be informed and have compassionate conversations about these big global challenges.
This has been a tough conversation, but an important one. Thanks for sharing your expertise.
Happy to be here.
And to all our listeners out there, keep exploring these issues, get different perspectives, talk to people, and be a force for good in the world. Thanks for tuning in to The Deep Dive.